The federal government is proposing several changes to Canadian citizenship laws. Permanent residents applying for citizenship would have to live in Canada for 4 years out of the last 6 instead of the current 3 years out of 4. Immigrants up to the age of 64 would have to pass a language proficiency test. That's up from 54. And if the legislation passes, Canadian citizens could be unilaterally stripped of their citizenship if found guilty of treason, terrorism, or spying charges. For his take on what it means for current and prospective immigrants, I'm joined now by Raj Sharma. He's an immigration lawyer here in Calgary, and he joins me on the line. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Doug.
So what do you make of these changes?
I think the changes, I summarize them as being the good, the bad, and the ugly. A lot of the changes are good. There was some issue as to what constituted residency for the purpose of obtaining citizenship in Canada. So it used to be you had to be in Canada 3 years out of 4, but not necessarily. It didn't necessarily mean that you had to have 2 feet on the ground. So people were applying for, and in some cases getting citizenship when they weren't actually living in Canada. So these new requirements or the raising of these eligibility will bring clarity to the requirements to apply. 2 feet on the ground, 4 years out of 6, not continuous, but at least 183 days per year. And I think most Canadians will be fine with those changes.
Yeah, what about the changes to language proficiency testing?
I'll put that down under the bad category. The changes of language proficiency, the problem with that is that the language testing requirements that they imposed even 2 years ago are kind of superfluous. There's a written knowledge test that's already required to become a Canadian citizen. And that testing is already done at the requisite language benchmark. So in terms of the extra language testing that they're requiring, and they're requiring it of from 14 years of age to 64. So I think it's superfluous. I think, a 14-year-old who's in Canada, who's applying for citizenship, who's been here for 4 years at a minimum, he's already statutorily obligated to attend school in one of Canada's 2 official languages. So I think that is probably superfluous.
And what about increasing the language proficiency test from 54 to 64?
Well, I think these are one of the changes where it has an unintended consequence, in the sense of these changes are kind of Anglophilic in their result. In the sense of that if an older person comes from England who's 55 or 60, and then that person can easily apply for citizenship and will get citizenship because English is their first language. Whereas a parent or grandparent sponsored from India or Pakistan or China, that person will never become a Canadian citizen. Because, simply put, it's going to be difficult, if not impossible, for them to acquire language proficiency late in life.
If this legislation passes, it'll also be simpler to revoke citizenship. How will that work, and what do you think of that change to the current act?
It's actually not bad, Doug. Between 1977 and a couple of years ago, only about 30 or so individuals were stripped of Canadian citizenship. That's because the process to strip Canadian citizenship was arduous and difficult, and it required an order in council. Basically, cabinet had to revoke someone's citizenship. And so the citizenship that were revoked were sort of these high-profile ones. So we do know that citizenship fraud has been rampant, especially out of certain places in Canada, such as Montreal. And so I think that revocation for the purpose, or unilateral revocation for the purpose where there's fraud or identity fraud or other fraud, I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. We need to recognize that Canadian citizenship is a sought-after benefit or commodity, and certain unscrupulous individuals will lie or deceive to exaggerate their time in Canada. So I think making something that was almost impossible to achieve in the past, making that more readily available, I think that will be a deterrent to certain individuals.
How do you think these changes to the Act could affect your work as an immigration lawyer?
Well, I think that they're making it more difficult to become a citizen. I think on a public policy point of view, that's not a bad thing. There's only one way of becoming a Canadian, in my opinion, and that's actually living in Canada. So increasing the residency requirement and actually requiring someone to be in Canada 4 years out of 6 is common sense, kind of makes sense. I think it will decrease the overall numbers of individuals applying for citizenship. There are global citizens, individuals that are here, businessmen that travel a lot, and that may impact on them ever applying or obtaining Canadian citizenship. That may be a negative overall effect, but could be offset by simply having it clear to prospective immigrants that citizenship to Canada is a two-way street.
We heard in the news about someone who was expressing a concern about how this might affect refugees, especially the language proficiency test. If they don't have the education that perhaps some higher skilled refugee claimants have, or prospective Canadian citizens. What do you make of that argument?
It's a good argument. I don't know what the numbers are involved. I mean, certainly you've got this sort of test that the Conservative government, they've increased this level of difficulty. Basically, an 8-year-old with a crayon could have passed the previous knowledge test to become a Canadian citizen. So they've made that a little bit harder. But I don't think those concerns are borne out in terms of the results. I have many refugee clients that pass the exam. They get the booklet. They study for it. I don't think it's borne out in the results. You have a few more people failing the citizenship test, but the majority of individuals still pass the citizenship knowledge test. So I'm not sure if that concern will be borne out by the actual numbers.
When do you think this might come into law?
Well, they've tabled the legislation. They've got a majority government. Every piece of legislation that the Conservatives have proposed has become law very quickly in the last couple of years. So I imagine that this will be law this year.
Raj, thanks for your time.
My pleasure, Doug.
Raj Sharma is a Calgary immigration lawyer.